Hello everyone, good evening. I hope you can all hear me properly. If you can't, or if there's any problem, then send an essay in one of the text messaging ways to Katie and she'll let me know. I hope you've got the popcorn out and ready for an interesting webinar. For those that missed it, I am Adam Harris, the Gallet guest curator of Wristwatches. And tonight I want to discuss the beginning of the wristwatch from 1888 to 1920. This page that's up at the moment shows a lovely lady, circa 1915, we can't date it exactly, wearing a leather pocket watch converter. And also beside that, to the right of it, is my favourite advert, which is termed the Big Fist advert. First used soft Elgin, not quite the same advert as the Big Fist by Elgin in the 1960s. Two interesting things actually about the advert on the right-hand side. Above the small picture on the left of it, where you've got the two wristwatches, it actually says that the armistice, which is at the end of obviously World War I, releases these watches for civilian use. That's an interesting point that we can note, because we definitely know then that these watches had to have been used and worn in World War I, and they were now released to civilian people. The second interesting thing of this advert is it actually explains the different styles of the watches which they, Elgin, had decided to name. So the round-faced one they called the Fock, and the Kitchener is a square, definitely with fixed lugs, and the Pershing, which is actually on this gorilla's hand, for want of a better thing, is a cushion shape and most likely fixed lugs as well. The interesting thing is they use this huge fist to make this manliness of the watch. They are trying to get over to people that watches are for manly men, and you wouldn't see many women with a hand with hair all over it like that. So I think we can assume that they're making this for a man. Okay, clicked the wrong page. Okay, you're now seeing page 2, which is the beginning of the wristwatch, and what we, because we learned together in the past 2 years. And I'm saying here in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, but who created the wristwatch? And as silly as that may sound, when I started to study horology, which was only about 10 years ago, we really never knew who made or when the first wristwatch was made. Who made it or when. And that's an amazing thing that even 10 years ago, the people that were teaching me, my mentor from Switzerland, who'd been 40 years in the watch industry, never even knew who made the first wristwatch. We've come a long way since then. I want to start with some assumptions that we made in 2012, or you can say that I made them, and whether they're true or false. The first one was the earliest wristwatch, or wristlet, was 1898. That was one of the statements which I made in my seminar in 2012. I also said in Europe, first man's conventional wristwatch, i.e. lugs, was 1904 in Europe. I said in America, the first man's wristwatch was 1916 or 1917. I stated that in World War I, wristwatches were only worn by officers. And I also said that Elgin was the first manufacturer to advertise men's wristwatches. Before answering these points, it's worth considering how best to date an early timepiece. That is really our problem. There's too many areas that can cause ambiguity. So what are the different ways that we can try to date these pieces that are really over 100 years old? Well, basically we've got the movement serial number. Pros, accurate for dating a movement. The cons, movements could have been fitted into a wristwatch case many years after its original manufacture, especially a hunter type of movement, because it fits perfectly into a conventional wristwatch case. With Lapine movements, we can see more easily that something has been changed and makes us more suspicious and to look more closely. We can tell the UK gold or silver assay mark. The pros, very accurate. Cons, may not be the original case. Third thing, we can look at the fixed lugs versus spring lugs. That's a good pro, gives us a general idea between 1900 and 1920, usually as fixed lugs. The cons, there's exceptions to the rule. We do find some manufacturers started early in the 1900s, 1910s, 1920s to put the spring lugs. Shock protection was introduced commercially in 1933 by Ingersoll. We do know others like de Polier had the Brune, had been patented as early as 1922, but were never widely adopted. So, shock protection can help us. The pros, gives us a general idea based on a patent of 1933. The cons, many manufacturers did not implement a Inca block till as late as the 40s. They had to pay for it. Each time they used it, they paid a charge. Enamel versus metal dials, another way of telling. Advertisements are a fantastic way to us to learn roughly when a watch was coming out. But recently, we've learned that a lot of these adverts are actually artists' impressions. And the pictures they show in the advert aren't exactly like the watch. So again, we have to be careful. Inscriptions in the back of a case. Each of these points can individually give us a clue to the date of the timepiece. However, I really want to emphasize, with so many marriage and more Franken timepieces, it becomes extremely difficult to always date accurately a timepiece. I want to give you a definition. Maybe it's my definition, but at least we should have one definition that we can talk through today. The definition between a marriage versus a Franken watch. To me, a marriage watch is a watch that was made up from pieces from the original manufacturer. It might be a different dial or a case. It's still a fake, but at least it's made by what we call an OEM, an original equipment manufacturer. A Franken is worse. A Franken is a watch made up from pieces of multi-manufacturers, or even custom, i.e. the movement from manufacturer A, a dial from manufacturer B, and then a custom case putting it all together. In this case, such a piece in any form never existed. So that is my two definitions. Let's move on to the beginning of the wristwatch as we know it. First is the true or false. I stated that the earliest wristwatch or wristlet was 1898. That's what I said 2 years ago, and that is false. I based it on an 1898 Theodore Roosevelt Spanish-Cuban-American War. We saw the Rough Rider wearing a wristlet. Remember this? And down in the bottom we can see the date quite clearly stated, 1898. We can see Theodore Roosevelt roughly in the middle and one of his Rough Riders wearing what we call a wristlet, a leather pocket watch converter. In 2013, I found this, dated 1898. Again, American-Spanish War, and it's I've headed it, an army marches on its stomach. We can clearly see the chef wearing a wristlet or a leather pocket watch converter. And that was dated 1898 on the back of the card, and it's the 5th Regiment Spanish War. And I own the card. We always knew that British officers wore wristlet watches during the Boer War, 1899 to 1902. We always knew that. These had proven strategically important against the Boers to coordinate artillery fire behind the lines prior to the troops attacking. This strategy became even more important, as we'll see later in World War I trench warfare. And here is my earliest 1899 picture of Major General Baden-Powell, who became the leader of the the Boy Scouts, wearing a wristlet. And we knew very well by that time that officers were wearing these types of wristlet. But thanks to a keen eye and a huge research by a colleague, a man called Robert Butler, my belief that 1898 was the earliest known picture of a man wearing a wristwatch was broken. What's amazing, it wasn't just broken by 1 or 2 years, but a massive 10 years. And what's even more amazing is it wasn't just one watch, but 3. 1888 is now the earliest known picture of men wearing wristwatches. And I have put quite a lot of research into this picture. The dating can be verified exactly from the battle. We can see 3 of them wearing the wristwatch. It's amazing. I find it even hard looking at it now to believe that 3 of them could be wearing it. It's dated by the 1st Brigade of Hussar Field Force commanded by Colonel Sim of the 1st Gurkhas in 1888. And it's definitely all correct. And fantastic work by Robert Butler to find it. So we now have the earliest dated leather pocket watch converter, or now termed wristlet, of 1888. Here are some examples of leather pocket watch converters termed wristlets, which I personally own. Here is one which we actually have in display here. It's a large size wristlet fitted with an early Gallet chronograph. It doesn't really matter what the date of the chronograph is. It's irrelevant because the actual timepiece is fitted whatever time the person would be using it at that period. But the wristlet is the earliest piece we've seen. Here's an original Mappin and Webb advert that I own from 1901, and they talk about the campaign watch, which they made to fit into that, and it's a solid leather wristlet. I own the campaign watch, I own the wristlet, and that's one of the adverts. The earliest time we ever have heard of anyone talking about a wristlet is in the journal, the Swiss journal of 1887. So that's the earliest mention of a leather wristlet, is 1887. After the Boer War, or basically after we see these officers wearing them, we see a huge gap from really 1900, 1902, right up to 1915, 1916, 1917. And in that gap it was women, and that's why I called it ladies first. So ladies didn't have jeans, they didn't wear trousers, they wore long dresses, and there was nowhere for them to put a pocket watch. So they wore what was termed a chatelaine, which was a chain that was put round their waist, and that they could hold a pocket watch, a small pocket watch of that, or they had a pendant, a pin to their dress. But it was very inconvenient. And of course, ladies, maids, servants, especially wanted to get this cumbersome thing onto their wrist. And that's why the picture on the right is actually dated. It's probably a maid, and it's dated 1915. But of course, World War I was the true beginning for men to wear wristwatches. And here we have a number of 2 pictures. The soldier on the left is a British soldier. The soldiers on the right are German. I chose those just because you can see the wristlet is very predominant, and you can see without doubt that they're wearing a pocket watch. We see very strongly nurses and medics in the First World War also wearing wristlets, and also later on we see them wearing small conventional wristwatches as well, with sweep second hands. But this watch, this one here, this nurse is wearing, actually is a sweep second one, obviously for taking pulses, and etc., etc. Here we can see the beginning of what I would call a conventional wristwatch, and made for a nurse or a medic. It's got a sweep second hand on it, a center sweep second hand. This one is actually made by Gallet. It's a World War I nurse's trench watch. It's a very early example of an indirect sweep second hand, which is driven off the third wheel, unlike most watches of today, unlike most watches of the period, where this at a sub-second at 6. This caliber was actually introduced by Gallet in 1912, but this piece is probably 1915 and 1916, possibly earlier. Have a quick look at the second hand. Look how big and large it is. It was predominant because it was so new and different. That's not an extra or a different hand. That is the original second hand that's been there to put on it to be bold so that everyone can see the beauty of it. And we have two of these on display. One is with the red cross, and the other one is actually marked ambulance, and I own another one as well. So moving on from the wristlet, the pocket watch moves from the wristlet to lugs. Here we have an 1895 Amiga, which I've dated by the hallmarks. I own the watch, and it's converted to a wristwatch, probably 1914, 1917. So it's been a little half hunter, a ladies, a pocket watch, and the lugs have then been soldered to it. So we're now starting to move from the leather wristlet to the lugs put on. Here we have another 1915 Amiga pocket watch, and the conversion has been done by Amiga. I confirmed that with them, and they've taken a huge big size 16er a pocket watch. I own the actual piece, and it's a single button, dated 1915, and they put a strap on it so that it can be worn on the wrist by an officer. And of course, we move to the conventional fixed lugs. These are not the Springlocks. And here we have an American Doughboy dated 1917. And I chose this watch specifically because we can see very predominantly him wearing the watch on the side of his wrist. And this is about 1917. So the beginning of the wristwatch, true or false? In Europe, first man's conventional wristwatch, i.e. with lugs, was 1904. Actually false. We now know Amiga marketed a wristwatch in 1902. Here are the adverts from 1906. I own this advert, dated 1906, and we know, although I haven't been able to purchase one, that the Amiga advertised this watch in 1904. Notice it's being worn on the left, on the right hand, on the inside of the right hand. That's because it was still difficult for people to understand that the pocket watch would have been inside somebody's pocket so safely that it could be worn on the outside of the wrist and maybe be knocked and banged. So we see a lot of the original adverts where the man is wearing it on the inside of the wrist. And we have a few of these adverts. Here is the advert from 1908, and it shows both the man's and the ladies. The man's is down in the bottom right-hand side. The ladies is up on the top left. Interestingly, also to point out that the crown is on the left-hand side, and we'll talk more about that later. Also interesting, the ladies' watch has got Arabic numbers, whereas the man's one's got Roman numerals. Why? I don't know. Myth 1, the left-handed crown watches were manufactured for left-handed wearers. Really, that is a complete load of rubbish. Why the left-sided crown? Did Amiga believe that in 1902, the beginning of the wristwatch would only be the left-handed people? Do we really believe that? I don't think so. No, not at all. But from the protected pocket watch to the exposed wristwatch, it was thought wearing on the inside of the wrist would award greater protection. Why had the wristwatch become so important by World War I? Surely not due to the soldiers or even the officers needing to know the time. Most never expected to live to get home. No, during the Boer War, British officers realized the importance of coordinated artillery bombardment to the exact timing of the troops attacking. So the artillery would bombard the enemy for 3 or 4 hours. They didn't actually kill many of them because they trenched in, but the noise was so devastating that it scared the enemy. And if you then, when the artillery stopped, if you went too early, you get blown up, you get blown to bits by your own artillery, and if you go too late, the enemy had regrouped. So you needed a watch to know the exact time to go. So during World War I, the officers had to coordinate 0 hour, which is the term, we'll see that later in an advert, or over the top. And that was the second where the artillery stopped. At a precise, predetermined time, the artillery stopped its barrage on the enemy positions, and the officer, with a pistol in one hand to shoot anyone that didn't go over, whistle and pocket watch in the other. It was just impossible to have a pistol, a whistle, a pocket watch, and probably a sword or a bayonet as well. So they needed 2 hands to coordinate, hence the wristwatch became as essential as his pistol. Here we have an Ingersoll advert, and it actually talks about 0 hour, the watch that signaled 0 hour. And this is the watch that the officer would have waited to the exact time when he took his troops over the top. And the watch in the bottom right, made by Ingersoll, in this advert, is actually on permanent display, as is the advert, in the National Watch and Clock Museum. We actually have 100% original mint watch in its original box, and we have it on display beside the advert. And although it's called the dollar watch, it costs $4.50. True or false? Elgin was the first manufacturer to advertise wristwatches. Unfortunately, false. Originally, I believed that the first Elgin wristwatch adverts were 1916, possibly 1915. Then I found this Elgin advert from 1913. And here we have an Elgin advert from 1913, and it states, ask Discro why he wears a wristwatch. Discro is one of your famous motorcycle driving indie driving people. And he says, why is it the only kind I can wear? You should wear an Elgin strap watch because it's the only convenient, loss-proof, perfectly reliable timepiece you can wear all the time. And it's worn by motorists, golfers, hunters, fishermen, sailors, aviators, horsemen, oarsmen, all sports people or soldier type of people, because nobody is ever going to imply that they are cowards or sissies. Sadly, the advert that I just showed from 1913, Elgin's glory was short-lived, as we discovered this 1912 Ingersoll advertisement for a wristwatch was found. And here we have the 1912 advert, again found for the same gentleman that found the 1888 advert of the wristlet, Robert Butler. And it's an advert, strangely enough, in the Sydney Morning Herald, and it's an Ingersoll watch, and it says wristwatch in 2 separate words. Like pocket watch was always 2 words, we now write wristwatch as 1 word. But in 1912, they still wrote it as 2 words. Strangely enough, though, in 1918, they still pushed wristlets. Why? Because size matters. And we see that pilots, aviators needed watches with big faces. Wristwatches were a mere 32, 28, 32, or maximum 34 millimeters. Here we've got another advert from September 18, and we can see the Ingersoll advert with the Ingersoll watch in the leather wristlet worn for an aviator. True or false? In America, the first man's wristwatch was 1916, 1917. False. Based on adverts, and again this one, we can say that USA men started to wear wristwatches about 1930. And here we have an advert from our Navy, dated June the 1913, and the acknowledgements go to Stan, Zubernat. And he found this, and we can see quite clearly that the Navy and Army were already talking about the watch that needs no pocket. However, 1912 may be the earliest American wristwatch that we find. In the book Timex, a company in its community dated 1858 to 1998 by Kathleen McDermott, on page 68 to 71, it addresses the rise of the wristwatch. Remember, this is Timex. A particularly interesting paragraph from page 69, and it reads, Robert H. Ingersoll and Brother and Waterbury Clock made a rapid conversion to wartime production, manufacturing thousands of modified Ingersoll's ladies' midget model pocket watches, a smaller, thinner style introduced in 1912, with special lugs soldered onto the case at 12 o'clock and 6 o'clock for threading the strap, and with the winding stem moved to 3 o'clock instead of 12 noon. Now, the important point here is that it says that they introduced this in 1912. If this is true, then there should not be any Ingersoll wristwatch adverts prior to 1912. Unfortunately, there's no footnotes or endnotes to indicate where Mrs. McDermott obtained this information. But the book, somehow she has managed to quote Robert H. Ingersoll, and he says that they did it in 1912. And I give acknowledgements to Patricia Holloway for pointing that important piece of information out to me. The beginning of the wristwatch, myth 2. Wristwatches were small so to avoid shrapnel damage in the trenches. Really, what a load of rubbish. Wristwatches were small for 3 reasons. Firstly, people were smaller. A 32mm or even a 28mm watch looked fine on slimmer people. 2, the watch was an essential timekeeper. It wasn't for vanity. And 3, there was no shock protection till after 1933. Wristwatches were more exposed, increasing their size increased the balance wheel, making them more prone to shock, the arbor and the bearing getting damaged. It was really nothing to do with shrapnel. If a piece of boiling, steaming hot steel shrapnel hit you, it took your whole arm off. It didn't just take the glass out of the watch. True or false? In World War I, wristwatches were only worn by officers. Well, I think this is going to be the most incredible thing that we'll learn tonight, because it's false. Because discovered in the General Order and Bulletins of World War Department, the War Department 1913 and printed in 1914, we can see that this clearly states which soldiers and officers should be issued with wristwatches per unit and by which battalion. We can read here that privates in the battalion should also be issued with wristwatches. And this is a government, it's the General Order and Bulletins of the War Department, dated 1913, but printed 1914. And here we have General Order number 15. It's the War Department, dated February the 20th, 1913. And the 6th, we can see in the down, and I've brought it out to the side, that it says that there should be 6, not 1, not 2, but 6 watches. And I'll explain why there should be 6 wristwatches issued. And again, I have to give really 100% acknowledgements to Stan Zubernat for his fantastic find of this. And believe me, trying to find these things is very, very difficult. So now we know that the Army in 1913, the American Army, was stating that officers and soldiers should wear wristwatches. How did they come up to 6? Well, if we look at the 3rd column, it says wristwatches. And if we go down, it says here that 3 corporals, stroke scouts, and 3 privates and Scouts should be issued watches. So we come to the total of 6 watches. And again, Stan Zubernat found this, and it's a fantastic insight now that we know that it wasn't just officers that were meant to wear these wristwatches, and it's a fantastic discovery. But even in 1911, we can find that the American War Department references wristwatches. Here we have the drill regulations for field companies of Signal Corps. And of course the Signal Corps had to know what time they were going to start the bombardment, what time they were going to stop it. This document is dated 1911. And again we can see here on the right hand side, and it's the third line up, it says 1 wristwatch. Okay, not 6, but 1. And note this is dated 1911, and it's stating 1 wristwatch. And again, this was found by Stan, and full acknowledgements to Stan Zubernat. So now we know the earliest mention by the American military is not 1916 and 1917, it's actually 1911. Here's another very, very, very cool piece. I own this piece. It's by, they call it a novel GAC wristwatch, which is the General Aeronautical Company, and it's a really cool piece. And this advert's dated 1915. It was in Flight magazine. And over the page, I've taken some better pictures of it. You can see that the top of the watch is actually a compass, and when you lift the top up, and it's spring mounted, but it closes automatically. There is the watch with a sub-second dial underneath. The watch is currently at in for repair with a master watchmaker, and once it comes back, we will put this on display in the museum. It's a pretty rare piece. It's the first one that I've ever seen. The glass is missing from the actual wristwatch part, so Jim is going to have to make a bezel and a glass for that, and fix lugs as well. Okay. Sorry, Katie was just checking you were all still there or something, I'm not sure. All right. Myth 3. Shrapnel guards were added to watches to protect against flying shrapnel. Really, again, I've got to say that's rubbish. If a piece of shrapnel, which is absolutely boiling hot, was to hit you, it would take your whole body off. So I doubt these meager guards would protect against burning hot shrapnel. No, they protected the watch crystal from knocks and bumps in the trench side. Here's a really cool American one from 1917, and I've actually attached the patent, which was patented on the 25th of September 1917, and you can see that the guard is actually made with the letters US, the United States. The other thing is it's a pretty big watch as well, so it actually goes in a very large watch, and I own that, and nice piece. Here's another interesting cool piece from about 1917-18. This one was very interesting because it was on eBay, the guard, and someone was advertising a guard for a pocket watch, and I thought, what idiot would be advertising a shrapnel guard for a pocket watch? Then when I went to investigate it, it's 100% correct. It's a 1918, and we can see that adapters for pocket watches to wristwatches, in this case with a shrapnel guard, and it's US patent 9417. So they've taken a small pocket watch, a size 0, and it allows a pocket watch to be converted to a wristwatch and worn on the wrist. And again, I bought this, and it's a lovely piece to wear. It's fantastic, and it shows that of the initiatives that people were using to get something on people's wrists. And here's the actual advert, and again, acknowledgements to Stan. And when I saw the eBay advert, and I thought, what idiot is trying to convince people that they made the shrapnel guards for pocket watches? And then I went to the site and I saw it was Stan's. I thought, well, he couldn't say that if it's not true. And then I investigated it, and it was correct. It was got the patent and everything. And Stan had the advert for it as well. It's a fantastic advert. And I want to draw your attention to what the advert says. It dates it to 1918. They call it the Duo. Enjoy the profits on specialty stamps and things. But then underneath it says, the only complete line of watch attachments used by soldiers, we knew that, hunters, we knew that, and now miners, farmers, mechanics, golfers, and motorists. So they're now bringing anyone that works underground or in trenches, anyone that's got a job that may get the glass of their watch damaged. And I just thought it was interesting that miners becomes the first one really after with the soldiers and the hunters. So that's a very interesting advert, an additional piece of history coming through. This is a fantastic advert which I managed to buy, and we can see an American Doughboy, 1917. But when we bring the advert out, we can see that the watch that he's wearing, fixed lugs of course, has actually got a shrapnel guard on it. It's fantastic when you can actually both see that the person's wearing a wristwatch, that's exciting, but when we can see what make of watch he's making or that it's got a shrapnel guard on it, it really adds to the whole thing, and it's a fantastic thing. So there we have this advert as well. Finally, in 1917, the United States entered World War I, and the military demanded motorcycles for the war effort. Harley Davidson had already been used with the military in the Pancho Villa expedition. But World War I was the first time that motorcycles had ever been adopted or used for combat services. Harley Davidson provided about 15,000 machines to the military forces during World War I. And here we have, as my last picture for you, a modified Harley Davidson motorbike with a 30mm machine gun. They've mounted two motorbikes together. They put a small carriage on the back, mounted a 30mm machine gun on the actual motorbike, and we can see the Doughboy is wearing a wristwatch. And I just think it's another fantastic piece of history. And that concludes my discussion. We can open it up to talks or questions now. I must have spoken too quickly. It lasted longer. It didn't last as long as it should. So Katie will tell me when you can, or how you can ask questions.
Right now, if anybody wants to, speak, just have them raise their hand on the control panel.
Okay, so apparently if you want to ask a question, you raise your hand on the control panel. Okay. So the earliest photo of an American is 1898 with the Rough Riders. Yes, that's no, it's actually, well, we've got the Rough Riders. To answer the question by Eric Bazerman, I hope I pronounced your name correct. His question is, the earliest photo of an American is 1898 with the Rough Riders. 1898, we have the Rough Riders, but we also have the American and the Spanish Civil War, the chef also wearing the wristlet. That is also 1898, and the Rough Rider is also 1898. So that is the earliest American picture we've got. Okay, and the next question is by Jeff Schulenfrey, and he says, when did Gallet get involved with wristwatches? World War I, and which military units? Well, Gallet have been making watches since about 1465. There's two things that every watch manufacturer wishes to claim. The first thing that every watch manufacturer wishes to claim is that they've had an unbroken record of making timepieces. From the beginning of whenever they started, they never stopped. So that's the first thing that every manufacturer of timepieces wants to claim today. And the second thing they want to claim is that they made the first wristwatch. And if we take people like Girard Perregaux, they still live on the myth and the legend that they made watches for the German Navy in 1886 or something. And if you go to their website, they're asking for if anyone can send them a picture of the watch, which doesn't exist. When did it? Well, I would say that Gallet probably started to make watches for wristwatches for the military around about 1912, 1913. The watch which I showed with the second sweep hand, with the center sweep hand, was they have that in their catalogue of 1912. When they first sold them to the military, we can only guess 1914 or 1915. Edward Popile, sorry if I pronounce your names wrong. Will you make this presentation available? Yes, you'll be able to download the complete presentation. I only ask that if you use the pictures or any of the things, you give acknowledgements to whoever found them, as I have done. I think that's only correct. And you'll get an email after this with all the details of how to get copies of the presentation, etc. Any idea what the Any idea what the production volumes were on wristwatches? James Ebrecht has asked that. Any idea if the production volumes were on wristwatches? I'd like to post. We do have some figures of how many wristwatches the American manufacturers were making, and we've probably got some idea how many Swiss were making. I don't have it off the top of my head. So what I'll do is we will post that. Where would we post it? Okay, we'll post it on the notice board, and I'll post it on the forums as well. Sorry, I don't know the immediate answer. Were wristwatches immediately popular, or did it take a period of time for them to become popular? Andrew Ekman. It's a great question, Andrew. So, for example, we know that Roosevelt and his Rough Riders in 1898, well, Roosevelt wasn't wearing, when Roosevelt came back from that war, he actually made a speech in 1902 where he said that only gentlemen and officers never would wear a wristwatch. But strangely enough, and I haven't shown it in this presentation, when Theodore Roosevelt ran for president the second time, 1915-1916, he used as his campaign giveaway a wristwatch, which is absolutely amazing, because the first thing is that he ran on the ticket that he kept the Americans out of World War I, and then when he became president in World War II, he actually took them in to World War I. And he used a wristwatch as his campaign gift. And I have the wristwatch, and it's got the picture of Theodore Roosevelt in the watch. So I would say that it took a long time from even World War I, not a long time, but it took time even after World War I, that the beginning had started. And it wasn't the beginning of the end, but it was the end of the beginning. And we could see slowly wristwatch production growing. I actually have the exact figures, and I will publish how much it grew by. This is Daniel Horton. Were the wristlets issued the troops, or did they purchase them individually? I would say that only, especially for the British, only the officers, and they had to buy them themselves. These were expensive pieces, and the British Ministry of Defence didn't give anything away. In fact, even after Second World War, most of the watches that were given to soldiers that had to have them were taken back from them. And even somebody that joins the army in Britain today when their time is up, the wristwatch is taken away from them. So absolutely, they weren't issued to the troops. And remember, soldiers didn't need a wristwatch. They never thought they were going to get home. 20,000 men or women died every single day in World War I, or went missing or disappeared, but 20,000 a day. They didn't care when they were coming. They just wanted to get home. When did the so-called Holy Trinity of watches, Patek, Vacheron, Audemars, start producing wristwatches? Well, we know that certainly Patek Philippe was making watches in 1837, 1847, 1867. So these people were making wristwatches as early as that, mainly ladies' ones. But 1900, they were all really starting to make watches. We know that Amiga was the first to really make wristwatches, but from 1910, Longines started to make wristwatches, and so did all the other majors. And that was asked by Jeff Schulenfrey again. Robert Greenson, curious, you mentioned watch stems were placed on 9, 12, and 3 o'clock positions. Were any watch stems placed at the 6 o'clock position? I'm trying to think what I mean by curious, you mentioned watch stems were placed at the 9. Watch stems, 9, 12, and 3. I can't remember. I can't think what you mean there. Do you mean, is it the crown? Robert, do you mean the crowns were at 9, 12, and 3? Ah, right. Okay, got you. Yes, we see crowns at the conventional 3 o'clock. We see them at 12 o'clock, and we see them at 9 o'clock. Yes, we have the other place that we see them is at 1:30, and I have a watch with the crown. It's a cushion-shaped watch, and it's at 1:30. Why do we see them at 1:30? Well, it's quite easy to know why. Because if you take an open-face Lapine watch, you've got the movement from an open-face Lapine watch. The crown is at 12. The number 12 is at 12, and usually the sub-seconds are at the bottom at 6. If you want to mount lugs in that, you can either move it right round to so that the crown in the 12 is at the 3 o'clock position, which is absolutely impossible to read, or you just move it round enough for you to put the lugs on, which takes it to what we call the 1:30 position. It looks like 2 o'clock, but it's actually 1:30. So we see crowns at 9 o'clock, 12 o'clock, 1:30, and 3. And the 1:30 and the 12 and the 3 are all to make way for the lugs. The 9, we really don't know why Amiga, just to protect the watch. I hope that answers your question, Robert. The next question from Evan. Can you speak about private label wristwatches where jewelers took smaller pocket watch movements and placed them either in converted cases or dedicated wristwatch cases? Okay, it's a good question as well, Evan, and welcome to the talk. So we know very well that many wristwatches didn't start out in the same case or as they were when we see them today. We had, especially in America, what you call jobbers. So in Switzerland, they tended to either ship the complete movement in a case, or they shipped their movement over to an agent. They had agents in Britain who then put them into the case and then sold them to the people. In America, you had what we call jobbers. So the jewelers could choose, and people actually came in and said, well, I quite fancy that dial, but I'd like a 7-jewel movement because it's cheaper, and can I have a case like this? So the different pieces were put all together. And many of the jewelers in that time, right up to 1926, 1927, the jewelers were more powerful than the wristwatch manufacturers or the movement manufacturers. And most of them would have their name on the dial. And it really wasn't until we see 1926, 1927, where people at Rolex said enough is enough. We're the ones that are developing all these watches. We're the ones that are designing, putting the research in. our name is going on the dial. And slowly they changed from being the retailer's name on the dial to the actual watch manufacturer. And we've got examples where the company de Polier, who made cases, they decided very early, back in 1917, that they would never become a major company if they allowed the jobber to decide which watch, which case, which movement when and put together. So they made the decision they would make a tie-up with Walden. So the de Polier watch company, who made more or less the first, I'm going to show that in the next webinar, they made the first totally sealed hermetic oyster watch in they actually patented it in 1915, some 11 years before Rolex. I'm going to talk about that next in 2 weeks' time. They made a tie-up with Walden, and they said to Walden, we'll always use your movement, we'll only advertise our case with your movement. And de Polier was probably one of the first companies in the world, watch companies in the world, sorry, to do heavy advertising of a case and a watch, always with the qualities of their case, the waterproofing and dustproofing of their case, but always with the same movement, always with a Walden movement. And the next question by Albert Antonelli. Is it safe to say that the Doughboy after World War I made the wristwatch popular for men in the USA? I would say yes, that's probably true to say, but there was still some skepticism, and we still have adverts from 1916, 17, where especially Elgin ones, where they see people, they treat a wristwatch, somebody wearing it, like it's a piece of excrement or something like that. But then they do adverts where they show a World War I doughboy wearing a watch, and the Elgin advert actually says, he says, do you mind going to tell him that he's a sissy or not a brave guy? So American advertising by Elgin actually started to show doughboys wearing a wristwatch, with the skeptics, the people calling them sissies and women, or effeminate, that's the word I was looking for, anyone implying, go over and tell him he's effeminate when he's when he fought in World War I, etc. So absolutely, Albert, that was the beginning. And I think, as I said earlier, it was the end of the beginning, and we see wristwatches coming. When did Jeff Schuldenfrey asked, when did the Boggle case first appear, and were there earlier waterproofing attempts with any success prior to Boggle? Francois Boggle patented the Boggle system in 1891. He was the first person to patent. It's a three-piece. It was a two-piece case where it was a pocket watch. Obviously, it's a two-piece case where the movement and the bezel, the glass, was one piece, and that's screwed into the back of the case. And that went right through till Boggle died, and his daughter took over the company, and they started to patent a wristwatch style. And well, let me just go to my book. Hold on, I'll tell you exactly. Hold on 1 second. Anyone wanting to learn about Boggle has to read David Bochard's articles that he wrote for the National Watch and Clock Museum. They are without any doubt, the best researched and the most interesting things to read. I remember the date of the original patent. So 1891, as I say, was the original patent, and then his daughter Louise, 1916, 1917, started to make wristwatch styles. The problem with the original Boggle design, which started as a pocket watch, where I say the bezel and the movement screwed into the case, it was a two-piece case, was that you had to pull the crown out, it had to be a negative set crown, so you could unscrew the movement. The crown couldn't be attached to the movement because it unscrewed out the case. So in 1916 and 1917, Borgle's daughter, Francois Borgle's daughter, Louisa, and one of his staff, or her staff, sorry, a man called Charles Rodin, invented a slightly different Borgle case. But we can say that the Borgle case started in a wristwatch 1916 to 1917. Jeff. When did the red 12 start in wristwatches? This is asked by Daniel M. White. Well, we've read lots of things why it was there. Some people said to decorate the watch. Some people said there's been loads of reasons. I will tell you what I believe, and I'm convinced that I'm right. It certainly wasn't there to decorate the watch, because the last thing that men wanted was for the watch to look effeminate and a kind of colour the dial with red. The reason is, and I can show it to you if you were beside me. When you take a watch with an offset crown, where the crown in 12 is at 3 or is at 130, and you put it on your wrist in a normal way, the red 12 just draws your attention to the fact that the 12 is now not at the top. If you look at your watch now, the 12 is at the top, and when people look at a wristwatch, whether it was when they looked at their Lapine wristwatch or they looked at their Hunter wristwatch, when they popped it open, the 12 was at the top. But because we took pocket watch movements and put them into wristwatches, we had to turn the dial round by 20, 30 degrees, 90 degrees if it was at 3 o'clock, 45 degrees or 35 degrees if it was at 1:30. And to do that, we put the red 12 just to draw the eye to it. Now, another very interesting thing is, if you take a watch with an offset crown, by offset crown I mean at 2:30 or at 3 o'clock, and you put it on the inside of your wrist, you wear it on the inside of the wrist, as we saw in all those adverts, it reads perfectly. On the top of your wrist, it looks offset. On the inside of your wrist, because your hand goes up at that angle, it reads, the 12 goes back to the top, and it reads perfectly. So to answer your question, the red is there just to give your eye that draw of attention. And as people at Stan will tell you, the nicest thing in the world is a white enamel dial with a red 12 on it. And I've got some watches with a red 12, and they're just outstanding pieces. Any more questions? Okay, Sergio, we're going to put you so you can ask your question verbally.
You can read it on mine. He's chat. I'm chat.
Hold on, I can't.
Manually set yours as an auto protect. Yeah. All I'm saying is if you set this one manually, maybe you would read it as opposed to doing the auto.
Okay, I can hear you now.
I would like it to do auto. You know,
I understand.
Yeah,
well, was that radio trying to work, or was it
Like a police scanner?
No, we've been listening to the beginning of the wristwatch. We had an webinar with the Scotsman, and the Scotsman's been telling us that in 1911 and 1912, what did the Scotsman say?
The 1911 is a wonderful handgun made by John M. Browning.
True or false? You know,
false.
Were officers mandated, only officers could wear wristwatches in World War I.
They only had 6 watches per battalion.
Yes. See, she knows that.
And they gave them to the men in the BAR units.
Bar units. What's that? It's not even Scottish, because the Scots don't have bars, they have pubs.
It's a Browning assault rifle.
It's a pub. It's like they're being attacked by a
the
pub.
microphone?
It's your, is that like an infield or something?
Why is that on?
Like a Royal Enfield?
So I don't know what you were asking, but we're not having an argument among all the people here. I think you were asking whether it's true that officers and think you were asking whether officers, it was only officers that wore wristwatches. 99% of the case, I would say it was only officers that wore wristwatches. Among the British side, although we now have evidence that certain American artillery groups or the signal groups were issued also with wristwatches. There's no other questions being typed. I don't really know what the argument was about. If you want to type your question, it's not a webinar without some tennis. Okay, I don't think there's any other questions. If not, does Katie want to round it up? Katie's just going to speak to you. I really appreciate everyone for staying and listening. We're going to do another webinar in a couple of weeks' time, which will, I hope, be good as well.